I'd now like to go on and introduce our third speaker today, Julian Hill. Julian Hill was elected as member for Bruce in the Australian Parliament in July 2016. He holds several major roles in parliamentary committees, and his electorate is home to many of the Victorian Cambodian diaspora. He was previously a councillor and mayor at Port Phillip Council before holding a number of senior positions within the Victorian Public Service in a wide range of fields. Welcome, Julian.
Thanks so much. And I'm really sorry, I've been having a little bit of a look through and seeing all the friends and people online. I'm sorry that we can't be together, although perhaps on the positive side, it does allow a wider group of people to participate in the commemoration, both here in Australia, and I know we're recording and broadcasting this, so over time, perhaps elsewhere in the world. I'll just acknowledge the President of the Cambodian Australian Federation, Hong Lim, the President of the Cambodian Association of Victoria, Yu Horn Chia, my friend Meng Heng Tak. I think now, following Hong Lim, you're the second Cambodian-born Member of Parliament in an Australian or indeed a democratic parliament. And of course, our eminent friends, Gareth Evans and the virtual Michael Kirby, as well as all the other activists who I can see there. I won't go through and name everyone, and people in Cambodia who may be listening now or in the coming days. I want to thank Gareth and Michael at the outset for their insightful reflections 30 years on today from the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, which did bring together the 4 combatant Cambodian factions and 19 other countries. Just a few words though on Gareth in particular, and to acknowledge at the outset his pivotal role in bringing peace to Cambodia is, I think it's fair to say, the key architect and driver of the peace accords. And yes, of course, as these things are, it was a collaborative effort. Many nations, many players in Australia and a lot of support, but none of us should ever underestimate the critical role that leaders play, like Gareth. We've seen in recent years under this government, that without firm, determined political leadership, the default state of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and our diplomatic architecture, and indeed most government agencies, the default state is usually inertia. We've seen DFAT be cautious and reactive, never wanting to upset anyone, maintaining dialogue at all times, incremental progress, and that certainly has a place. It may indeed be the day-to-day business as usual for skilled diplomats, but moments of real change and achievements like the Paris Peace Accord require political leadership to intervene, to shape, to demand real results. And against all odds, Gareth didn't give up. There were a few setbacks along the way, as I read in your book in great detail, but you pushed through. And I think Australia can indeed be proud of the role that our nation played in a period of wonderfully activist foreign policy, where we didn't just sit by passively in the world. We had agency and we went out and had a crack. We didn't achieve everything we wanted, but we had a crack. And Australians today, looking back, can be equally proud, I think, to know that it was the work of a Labor government with a truly great Australian Foreign Minister 30 years on today. The Paris Peace Accords did have 3 objectives: peace, to end the cycles of violence, and they were cycles of violence that caused the death of more than 2 million people, to entrench at least a version of human rights and global norms in Cambodia, and democracy, that simple but most powerful right of people to choose their own government. An honest score, as we've heard, is that 1 out of 3 were achieved. The situation with respects to human rights and democracy is dire and getting worse, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But at the outset, we should acknowledge the profound achievement, at the very least, that bringing peace represented. A personal reflection, intellectually, I knew of the horrors of the Pol Pot genocide, but it wasn't until 2 years ago, in August 2019, that the true scale of the disruption and destruction and the unchecked violence and insanity of the Pol Pot period really sank in for me. And indeed the destructive role, the geopolitical overlay, the destructive role of many regional countries and foreign actors. It was in 2019, just on 2 years ago, that I visited Cambodia with my friend Meng Heng Tak. We visited the Genocide Museum, the killing fields. It was the first time that Heng had been to those places, and I was privileged to be there with him. It was an emotional time. We talked not just of what had happened as we walked around, but also the dignity of the survivors of that period, so many of whom are in Australia. They don't talk of that period much, some never at all. But we should never underestimate, and today I think acknowledge and celebrate the success that the peace accords represented. We shouldn't gloss over the achievement of peace whilst we reflect sadly about the state of democracy and human rights. But while there, we did meet with human rights organisations, independent trade unions, victims of the regime and community leaders. And what we both saw truly shocked us. I've spoken in other forums about the destruction of Sihanoukville through Chinese investment. I won't repeat that now. I think I said at that stage it was probably the worst place that I'd ever been. What once was a beautiful place that's been destroyed through Hun Sen giving away sovereignty to China. The appalling deterioration in human rights situation is well documented. Michael Kirby touched on the history of that, but these days through Human Rights Watch and the poor bunny that is the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights today. But we saw it firsthand. We met with trade union groups and NGOs, draconian new laws that undermined their rights, restricting freedom of assembly and the ability of people to organise. And it's got worse through COVID, like many authoritarian dictators. This gangster regime has used the cover of COVID to seize more power. We sat in villages and fields and met with poor families whose land has been stolen by Hun Sen. We met covertly, subversively, with government critics and democracy activists. We met with the inspiring Kem Lay when he was in Melbourne, Dr. Kem Lay, who was murdered for simply speaking up in support of democracy. Someone said to me, the government killed the chicken to scare the monkeys. Street protests are effectively banned now. Ordinary citizens harassed by the police just for speaking up on social media and sharing a view. Human rights organisations were genuinely fearful, and the workers there doing that work still are so brave, but they pleaded with all of us to keep speaking up about what's happening. The state of democracy in Cambodia is worse than you can imagine. The opposition party, as we've heard, it was dissolved before the last election. Hun Sen won 125 seats out of 125 seats. I mean, you know, even I don't think we should win 125 seats. I'd like to have a few more seats in the parliament for the Labor Party, but we don't need 125. That's not a functioning democracy. But as some wise insiders observed, it's not really a one-party state. It's a one-family state. And Hun Sen is establishing himself as Southeast Asia's Robert Mugabe. But one of the big things that has shifted in the last 10 to 20 years certainly is the impact of Chinese influence. And I try to have a nuanced view on China. I was chair for some years of the Parliamentary Friends of China, but I don't see what Hun Sen has let China do in Cambodia as positive. He sold out his country's sovereignty such that China treats Cambodia as a client state, and in return, Hun Sen gets political support for his gangster regime. That's globally, certainly the diplomatic cover in the United Nations, but also, as we heard, through technology transfer, surveillance transfer, holus-bolus bits of the authoritarian model are being exported, and indeed even shutting down the trade union movement, one of the probably the largest democratic actor in society with the ability to mobilise people. And so they've started importing the Chinese model of trade unions, government-run trade unions, which are clearly a nonsense. And so I don't believe it's in the interests, Australia's interests, for a peaceful, stable region to see Cambodia drift away from their historically neutral position, or at least stated neutrality, towards authoritarianism. And even factions in Hun Sen's government are upset by this, which does provide a clue about how we may influence over time. People talk despairingly of the takeover of independent media outlets taken down or taken over by government cronies. But so the question for Australian countries that promised in 1991 to support peace and democracy is what, if anything, can be done. And of course, we have to be honest, Australia's influence is limited. But when visiting Cambodia, the question I probably badgered everyone with in talking with them is, well, what can countries like Australia do to help? Realistically, given the reality of the situation and the battles that you're fighting, what can we do to help? And there were many answers, but my conclusion was that ultimately democracy and a change in Cambodia's political situation can only come from the Cambodian people, but there are critical things that those outside Cambodia can and must do to help, to give support, to give space for civil society to speak up. And I think Suya captured much of that in that beautiful book with stories of more optimism perhaps than we often hear. But first, the first step to recovery is to know you have a problem, as they say. First, we need to be honest with ourselves in Australia and global partners and admit that the current approach is not working. We need to speak up in every way, in every forum, and tell the truth. Now, as I said at the outset, Australia's default diplomatic approach is to just keep talking with Hun Sen, but it's insufficient. build diplomatic capital to achieve outcomes, yet Australia can't point to anything much in recent years except the most disgraceful refugee deal, which the current Prime Minister signed. And Hun Sen is playing the Australian government, the Morrison government. People explain to us, though, that hearing people in the global community, others outside Cambodia, speak up even today, gave them hope and courage. They share our stuff on social media. I was stunned to discover in some parts of Phnom Penh, I was a social media star, far more famous in my own electorate. But that international scrutiny moderated Hun Sen's worst excesses to at least allow some space for debate and civil society, keep the flame alive. But secondly, Australia can and should coordinate actions, including considering targeted sanctions, or I think we're now past considering, imposing targeted sanctions against key members of the Hun Sen regime involved in human rights abuses and suppression of democracy, as the USA has done. Hun Sen's cronies, and they don't want their assets and wealthy lifestyles in Western countries threatened for them or their children. Visa bans and asset freezes would have an impact. And Australia has really direct ties, including in my electorate, I'm ashamed to say, in parts of southeast Melbourne, as has been documented, really direct ties to key members of the regime. The government could do this now, or they could hurry up and pass the Magnitsky laws. There are many other things I won't dwell on in detail: getting back in the information game, using Radio Australia, Radio Free Asia, getting back into shortwave radio, being more sophisticated on social media, more public diplomacy. We still have a lot of soft power in Cambodia, and we should use it. More people-to-people diplomacy, that's cheap. Some more targeted diplomatic and aid efforts, and they will never be the centre of focus in Cambodia, but we can work with other partners. And pushing back, as I think we're starting to do, on foreign interference in Australia by the CPP to protect the Australian and Cambodian community from their propaganda and threats and preserve their ability to speak up in support of our values. But the final question I'll just address briefly is whether there's any continuing role for the 1991 Paris peace agreements. Now, Hun Sen, of course, in the last couple of years has been desperately trying to erase the Paris peace agreements from history, describing them as a ghost. He abolished the public holiday recently that was there for many years to commemorate their signing. And in a moment of what you might describe as peak irony, he described the agreements as an example of foreign interference, all the while he's selling Cambodia's coastline and sovereignty to China. But the agreements are of continuing moral and legal relevance at the very least. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights stated only a decade ago that the agreements will remain relevant until their vision is a reality for all Cambodians. And as we know, the agreements contain a formal mechanism, Article 29, to bring together countries in the event of serious human rights violations. And many would say that it's way past time that this clause was triggered, because there's no doubt that the threshold test has been met of serious violations. Now, any signatory, including Australia, could write to the UN Secretary General and other signatories to trigger Article 29. Now, I accept Gareth's realist view that without stronger interest by major world powers in Article 29, it would be of little ultimate utility. The Human Rights Council is broken, and as we know, China will provide that diplomatic cover within the UN architecture. But I do believe it's worth formally considering, at the very least, a forum of the willing, if you like, to appropriate that phrase for good perhaps, a forum of those countries willing to honour the promise that they made to the Cambodian people could highlight the situation. It would be interesting to see who did not turn up, and at least coordinate pressure regarding these international actions, Magnitsky sanctions, and as Gareth rightly observed, the need to seriously increase diplomatic pressure on Hun Sen about enabling an opposition to participate in the next elections. And of course, through the historic agreement, Australia and the world made a promise to the Cambodian people. It represented a promise, unfulfilled, to stand up for human rights, peace and democracy, but the world has failed to keep that promise. While Hun Sen's regime has attacked human rights, killed democracy, given away sovereignty and accumulated secret wealth overseas. So in conclusion, let's hope that the 30th anniversary generates some attention and action from interested governments. I'm not optimistic about our government taking further action at this time, but we must work, I believe, for a change of government at the election and to elect a Labor government that will reclaim Australia's proud legacy of activism on the world stage in support of our values of peace, human rights and democracy. And in closing, can I also warmly congratulate and acknowledge Cambodian Australians in particular. The contribution that you've made over many decades now to every facet of Australian life. You may be a small community, perhaps in numbers, but you've integrated and making your own contribution to Australia, but you've never forgot your homeland. And so many Cambodian Australians take great personal risk in speaking up for these values for human rights and democracy, as we're seeing, I know, in another conversation with the harassment of the diaspora. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this commemoration today. Thanks, Sue. Thank
you, Julian. And that was an excellent array of issues that you've raised. And I should let you know that Hun Sen has just printed a new note, which has a wonderful picture of him and Sihanouk sitting, shaking hands. And this is like for the anniversary of the Paris Peace Agreements. And he's also holding a function, a major function, having abolished the holiday in the Peace Palace. So I think there's a lot of irony around that altogether. But you pointed out some very important issues here and painted a picture too of what Cambodia is like. That travelling to Sihanoukville, indeed, it is an absolute shock, certainly from when I was last there. The China issue is extremely important. And I also the issue of the Paris Peace Agreements, which you've taken a slightly different angle on, and I think other panellists might too. So it will be good to pursue that discussion. So thank you very much, Julian. It's excellent.